Sir Geoffrey Palmer, great to be with you here today for another episode of the Both Sides Now podcast. Thanks very much for taking the time, and great to be here with you.
Okay, good luck.
Well, it's very fortuitous timing because your amazing book has just come out, Democracy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, which is awesome timing here. So, and personally, I really enjoyed the section looking at a bunch of different ideologies in there, and super appropriate for the way we start all of our interviews, which is what political ideology or philosophy do you personally identify with?
Well, as you've seen from the various competing ideologies that exist, they are very different. And it goes back to the differences between Plato and Aristotle, whether you were going to be ruled by philosopher kings or a more pragmatic approach to politics. And my own view is that an Aristotelian approach is better than the one advocated by Plato. In modern terms, I would describe myself as a person who believes in social democracy, as a person who has progressive views on things. I don't believe in communism, and I think it's a pragmatic approach to some degree. I think people who made ideological arguments in New Zealand politics don't fare very well. A lot of people who go into politics are ideologically driven, but they have to confront the real difficulties of pragmatism and the New Zealand approach.
And would you, I noted in the book, you discussed both libertarianism and liberalism.
Yeah.
Would you be able to define the difference between the two? Because that's something I've always struggled with. Is one sort of more about positive and one about negative liberty? Or?
I think there's something in that distinction. I think libertarianism is a more extreme view of having little, if any, government, whereas liberalism is a mixture of allowing as much freedom as you can, commensurate with what you judge to be the public interest. Liberalism is a very influential philosophy for a long time, but it's not faring very well at present because it lacks specificity.
And I noted they came under libertarianism in your book. Where do you think is it possible to put sort of one ideology on National and Labour in New Zealand?
I think it's quite difficult because it all depends on what they do, and political parties veer, they tack and change their views, they adjust to new situations. It's really, these labels have long histories, but they're not very helpful. They don't tell you what's going to happen. And the doctrine of the mandate is pretty well extinct in New Zealand because of MMP. You can't rely on political promises because, for the most part, under MMP, a party doesn't have a majority and it has to go hunting for support in the House. The first rule of politics is to learn how to count, and you have to have the numbers.
Well, that probably leads us right into talking about politics and your time in politics. Obviously, you were a massive part of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And we've seen in recent COVID times, a lot of New Zealanders' rights have been limited. Do you wish, in hindsight, that you would have been able to give the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act more force?
I think the notion that the Bill of Rights Act has not performed well in relation to COVID is wrong. And I think that any idea that rights are absolute is also wrong. And a lot of people who are not trained in these matters think if you have a right, it is absolute, and it's not. I thought that the New Zealand courts performed very well with the Bill of Rights Act. The Bill of Rights Act is based on the Canadian model, and there are two great restrictions. First, they're not absolute, and second, the measures that are adopted have to be reasonable in a free and democratic society. The courts in New Zealand have been applying those self-same tests. In addition to that, you have to understand that the whole of the COVID question has disrupted the whole of the system of New Zealand government profoundly. We're not back to normal. We may never be back to normal. COVID was something in the nature of a war, but not a war with weapons, but a war with a virus, and the measures that the New Zealand government had to take resulted in the greatest amount of law that we've ever had being passed very quickly, and a lot of it in subordinate legislation. And that placed enormous strains on the system. And because of those strains, the system wasn't able to do a lot of other things. And people have little knowledge of how the New Zealand government works. Even students of public law are pretty ignorant when they come into it. And that is because they're not taught civics at school. We have a system of representative government. That system of representative government requires us to elect people. They make the decisions. They need to consult us in ways that are better than at the moment. We need to have a much more responsive political system, and people need to get engaged with it. The amount of ignorance is profound. Andrew Butler and I wrote a couple of books about how to reform the New Zealand Constitution, an agenda which is still urgent, but will not be adopted in current conditions because it won't be on anyone's list of priorities. But actually, our constitutional arrangements have little insufficient checks and balances in them to protect people. The Bill of Rights is a great protection, an important one. And the important thing to understand about the Bill of Rights is, and this has happened only this year, where the Privileges Committee had to examine the question of how you would handle declarations of inconsistency from the courts. What they decided was that they would entertain them. They have published the bill is at its second reading, and what it has done is to provide a chink in the parliamentary sovereignty armour that is such a negative effect on the New Zealand body politic as a whole. We must be the last people on the planet who really believe in Dicey. I mean, if you look at what troubles the United Kingdom has got itself into, you wouldn't think that that's any sort of model. And so I just think that these simplist answers that you get about these matters are really not helpful.
So you talk about the fact that you think our system's kind of not working very well at the moment and we need constitutional reform. Do you sort of have an ideal how you would like it to change or how you'd like it to look?
Yeah, well, I think you need to give more weight to the Bill of Rights, but don't treat it as something that's absolute. I think that we are on the road to doing that after a long period of quiescence. It took many years for the judges to pluck up the courage to make declarations of inconsistency, and now that's happened, those matters can be better considered. Now, if you're talking about checks and balances, you have to talk about the Parliament. What is not well understood in New Zealand is that there is a Parliament to which, or the House of Representatives, to which the ministers are responsible. There are 28 members of the executive, so they are not part of the backbench. They can't hold people to account except through caucus, which meets in secret. Now, the problem is that the number of MPs we have has made it difficult, if not impossible, for the Parliament to develop expertise on bills of rights issues. For a long time, the Attorney General's reports were disregarded, not even mentioned in debate, and the various select committees were considering it, so they built up no expertise. We need to have 150 members of Parliament. That's a very important policy change if you're going to get real accountability of the sort that the Westminster system is based on. But in New Zealand, which is a stripped or racing version of the Westminster system, you don't have the depth of experience. Every MP in New Zealand would want to be a minister. That's not the case in the House of Commons, where you've got more than 600 members. It's idle to think that you would get there. And a lot of them build effective careers as backbenchers. That's pretty unknown in New Zealand. They all want to be ministers. And the general public has very little understanding of the difference between the executive and the House. And they know that parliamentary questions happen, but of course, a lot of the backbenchers are from the government party. They don't want to embarrass the government. They don't want accountability. And on the whole, the scrutiny system doesn't work well. The scrutiny system depends upon having robust and properly serviced analysis of bills to ensure that they are properly drafted, properly thought through, and will be effective. The New Zealand habit is to legislate first and repent at leisure.
Yeah.
So do you think we value political rights too highly compared to our social rights? For example, housing. Have we got the right balance there in New Zealand?
Well, there are two answers to that question. First of all, the practicality of producing outcomes is easier for civil and political rights than it is for social and economic rights, because the courts do not write the budget. That comes from the legislature. It's no use having a whole range of court decisions that are not financed. And there is really, from a practical point of view, a fundamental misunderstanding about what government can do. I mean, what New Zealanders don't understand is that the state is very powerful. It has a monopoly on the use of force, as people who demonstrated over the road found out. And in fact, the idea that people they must have political rights to express themselves. Freedom of expression is vital. The right of assembly is vital. There's a whole lot of civil rights that impinge upon the operation of the political system, and in a good way. And in a closed society, that's what you don't get. So the value of civil and political rights, and electoral rights as well, is that it keeps the democratic edifice alive. Now, I want to enter into another aspect of this debate. The reason that my granddaughter and I wrote this book is that democracy is under threat in a lot of countries. Democracies can disappear. That it is no longer a fashionable form of government. What is happening is that there are increasing numbers of autocracies. There is international competition at the geopolitical level between democracies and absolute dictator sort of governments. And the difficulty with it is that democracy itself has got some rotten characteristics. Some of those, the use of social media, and in particular the Brexit referendum and the use that was made then of the analytical material and the way in which the whole it was a scandal what happened in the United Kingdom, the use of data, and the company that did it went bust. But the damage was done, and we have now vertical and horizontal means of communications which are in social media really insidious, because you have the ability to advance conspiracy theories at will, and no one, people run down a conspiracy rabbit hole and don't get out of it. They don't know what the facts are, and they don't know how to find the facts, and they're not very well educated. And democracy, therefore, becomes susceptible to populism. People with simple anodyne solutions, which probably won't work, and Trump is a wonderful example of this, sort of make promises that people believe, and they're not, and then you tell big lies. I mean, he's not the first politician to do that. Goebbels was the master of the big lies, and we know where Hitler ended up. So you know, big lies have become a sort of staple of political debate now, and there are dangers in that. And above everything else, you have to remember that liberal democracy has served us pretty well, and to get rid of it in a fit of absent-mindedness is not a very good idea. The Christchurch call has found that it's very difficult to affect the great behemoths of Silicon Valley. But nevertheless, that effort has to be made if the channels of communication are to be kept open. I mean, social media has, and all these great big platforms, have damaged political communication enormously. Now, people who are political leaders have a great deal of difficulty communicating directly with their electorates now. And the ordinary methods of hierarchical debate are disturbed by all this horizontal stuff. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but we've also seen the weakness of the media. The weakness is that their whole of the traditional media is that its business models have been completely damaged by the digital revolution. And money is now to be made elsewhere, not by selling newspapers, and people don't read them. And the newspapers have changed their techniques. They don't report what goes on in Parliament anymore. You can find a lot of material in New Zealand by looking at websites, but who's got the time to do that? And there is now a concatenation of voices out there that create enormous confusion, and there are no gatekeepers.
So I guess that gatekeeping point kind of moves quite nicely to our next question. So you talk in your book about the Christchurch call and your concerns around fake news, as you have also just now. Is there kind of a way we can strike a balance, looking particularly at the hate speech proposal that's currently before Parliament? Can we strike a balance between hate speech and free speech?
I think you've got to be very careful with hate speech. I made a submission about that to them. The thing about freedom of speech in a democracy is that political speech needs to be protected. Now, that doesn't mean that you can engage in racism or demonising, and we do have a little bit of legal protection in the Human Rights Act against that now. It's not used very much, but extending it extensively is problematic if you're going to cut down democratic debate. I think there is a kind of resistance to that, and if you are interested in keeping freedom in a democratic sense alive, you must pay a lot of attention to protecting the channels of political speech. So
is that our most important right we have then, free speech or political speech?
I don't know that it's the most important one we have. The most important one we have is to have a democratic system of government. And free speech certainly contributes to that. Just remember that free speech is not an absolute either. Yeah. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, you can't cry fire in a crowded theatre.
You know, you were sort of a big part of the creation of the RMA. How does it feel that there's a lot of sort of negative sentiment on the RMA out there in society?
Well, it's not at all surprising. The RMA has been extremely badly administered by both central government and local government. It was a reform that was at the very edges of what could be achieved, and actually it has not achieved much. And the reason it hasn't is the environmental indicators have all gone backwards since then. They haven't been advanced. And partly what I think we need, in this funny sort of way, the most operative parts of the RMA were in part 2, and the rest of it was procedure. The notion of legislating for procedure in a very prescriptive way is probably a mistake. What you need is concentration on principles. What we haven't got is adequate protection for the natural environment. The natural environment is what produces everything that we value, and we haven't got that right in New Zealand. And what Richard Clarke and I think is that you need a new Natural Environment Act that protects the environment. And what you do with the built environment and what you do with cities and what you do with planning is not the same as environmental protection. The original RMA was based on the report of Gro Harlem Brundtland about a sustainable future. But there is within the whole concept of sustainability an enormous paradox. You can have sustainability or you can have development, but you can't necessarily have both, well, certainly not in one situation. And that's what it's at that interface that you have to deal. Now, in a country which has despoiled a lot of its environment and certainly polluted its water for the purposes of producing exported goods, that is a big dilemma. And in New Zealand, the big pressure groups like Federated Farmers and the business community has a hell of a say. And they are not necessarily supporting the public interest, but their own. And there has to be limits on what you can do to the natural environment, because we've got one of the most heavily changed natural environments. There's only, last time I looked, there was only 15% of the lowland forest left in New Zealand. It was all chopped down and put sheep farms on, a lot of it, which are sheep farms are not as bad as dairy farms in that sense. But we have despoiled our natural environment in ways that, if we are not careful, the qualities that we value in New Zealand will be lost to future generations. And what we said, in fairness to future generations, and it's in the RMA, is a fundamental factor, but it hasn't been implemented because the government had the power under the Resource Management Act to supervise, to make environmental standards, to do a lot of things. The central government, under both political parties, was asleep at the wheel. They didn't want to concentrate on this. It was very difficult. Local governments were not up to the task. They produced a plethora of plans. So I remember once doing a review of the local government in this area, including the Wairarapa and Pororua and Upper Hutt and Lower Hutt and Wellington. Why would you have a whole lot of different plans in what is a single urban area, really? So why would you have Upper Hutt and Lower Hutt? I mean, I was involved and I chaired the Cabinet Committee that dealt with the local government reforms. We need a whole range of that again. I remember the Mayor of Riccarton coming to see me in my electorate office saying, "Oh, Riccarton has to survive." Riccarton didn't survive, and who is losing it? Who needs it? And you can't ignore changes and still have the same sort of approach to how you deal with local government. So local government is a great area that needs reform in New Zealand, because it can act, if it's properly structured, as a check and a balance against central government in some respects. But I'm afraid, on the evidence of the RMA, the central government was absent and the local government was incompetent.
So to clarify, if we had the removal of the RMA with the new Natural Environment Act, would that be a direct replacement, or would we need some other legislation alongside that?
You need an RMA replacement of the sort they're designing, but you have to have a natural environment below it. And
climate change, this is something that both Eve and I are really passionate about. I guess we're quite curious as to what was your understanding of climate change at the time you were in office.
Well, we got the first report of the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1990, when I was Minister of the Environment, and we adopted that year a whole lot of policies about transport emissions and all other emissions that were swept away by the government that came to power then. And of course, New Zealand has been a laggard on climate change for the reasons that are connected with the drivers of the RMA in relation to the pressure groups. And because of that, these issues are not properly analysed. For years, we didn't have adequate data about how the environment was performing, and there are still problems with the way that is done, because ministers don't like the truth to be told in stark terms. It doesn't help them. But the purpose isn't to help them, it's to actually protect the environment. And there has to be some robust honesty about these issues.
Mm. And so the Zero Carbon Act, you said in your book it's been monumental for youth participation and interest in policy. Do you think that was a one-off, or do you think that momentum's been maintained through COVID?
I think engaged in politics. I said in a book that we published in 2016, was it, that the youth should get the vote. We repeated it in this latest book on change, and it's in here as well. And there are moves to do that. One of the reasons that you get people who are cynical about politics is that they don't think they can make a difference. They don't think that anyone listens to them. And I think concerted youth movement on the environment is absolutely essential. Gwendolyn, my granddaughter, was leader of the Roots and Shoots group at Wellington High School. And that has been a very effective thing internationally. And I think that once you get young people involved, if you gave them the vote at 16, they would be interested at school in learning about civics. There is no compulsory education on civics in New Zealand. That is why young people are so ignorant about it. They don't know how to go and see their MP. They don't know a lot. And it's not their fault because no one ever taught them. And I've been critical for 40 years about the absence of a civics education in New Zealand.
So you say that you think youth don't vote because they don't believe they can make a difference. What do you say to that? I've got two of my flatmates have never voted and they say exactly that to me. One vote doesn't matter. What do you say to them?
Well, it does matter. And organisation matters. If you organise the voting public amongst the young people into a coherent group, you will certainly succeed in having effect. Politicians listen to that. But you need organisation, you need involvement, you need to know what you're talking about. One of the problems about young people is that they don't often know how policy analysis works. And the difficulty is that the world has become so infinitely more complicated. When I was a law student, the idea that you'd have to have climate change legislation, no one had ever thought of it. The conceptual problems in doing that are enormous. Think globally about it. You cannot have an effective climate change policy unless you have some international law. And you have to have the ability to have norms that are followed about emissions. We haven't got that machinery. The Paris Agreement is in a bad state at the moment because nobody has done what they said they were going to do. And with a war on in Ukraine, I doubt that they will. So, you've got to keep at this. It's one of the worst features of our political system is that it concentrates on the next election. It's as if elections are the only thing that matters. Elections matter very little, actually. It's the substance of the policy that you adopt that matters, and the choices that you make. And that is an analytical process and has to be based, as everything is, like COVID is, on science now. And the climate change science has been clear since 1990, and yet the New Zealand performance has been appalling.
So on youth as well, I guess building on that, you talk in your book about this idea that you have a lot of youth engagement online, and you mentioned the phrase slacktivism, which I think is a term that a lot of youth know about, kind of just mass sharing things on social media. Yeah. Do you think that's actually helping with youth engagement, or do you think it's just sort of giving them a false impression of participation?
Well, I think it does give them a false impression. It doesn't require any effort from them. And if you're going to make change, you've got to work at it. And you've got to know what change you want to make, and you've got to know why you make it, and you've got to campaign for it. We've got chapters in here about how to campaign.
Yeah, I think that's something we would both support. And changing lanes slightly, there's this notion, I guess with Jacinda Ardern and with other politicians, that being a career politician, you're somehow sort of slightly inferior. You were very well known as being a very academic politician.
That's not an advantage. Not in this country.
Is there? I think it's definitely an advantage from your ability to get things done, but possibly not from a social image perspective. No. Is there? And Chris Luxon's got this sort of persona as a businessman. Is there a background to becoming a politician that is better, or are they all sort of equal?
Arnold Nordmeyer once said something quite profound. It's a House of Representatives, and you have to represent all segments of the public. And actually, MMP does that much better than the first past the post system did. Because if you take Lyndon Johnson's rather crude aphorism, it's better to have everyone in the tent pissing out than people outside the tent pissing in. And actually, MMP has got a much more inclusive system. And MMP is the most important electoral reform we've ever had. And MMP has changed the behaviour of our government. And people sort of don't really understand that very well, but they get 2 votes, and that gives them considerable power. And elections are important, and you've got to have free and elections, but there are problems with our electoral law as well, and especially the question of funding of political parties. That we used to talk about state funding in the 80s, but no one talks about that now. And if you're not careful, politics becomes the prerogative of the rich.
So I guess kind of continuing on this idea of sort of politics generally, do you think the left is better than the right?
Well, it depends what you mean by that. And I would prefer to say that it's best to judge on the basis of the performance of the policies. But the way in which policy is now made in the system in New Zealand, we used to have a lot more royal commissions than we had. The MMP came from a royal commission that I set up. And that is a very important way of getting what I'd call politically neutral, rigorously researched, effectively presented policy ideas. The fact that that came about was a major miracle because both National and Labour opposed MMP. But it came about anyway because people voted for it. But you can't do very much by referendum. You have to restrict referenda to constitutional subjects because otherwise it's unmanageable. Because if you look at what's happened in California, they have a proposition system that allows you to get things voted on in referenda, and people always vote the same way. They vote for more government services and less tax.
So you weren't a supporter of the marijuana referendum or the euthanasia referendum in the last election then?
I think, no, I wouldn't. I would have done it through the House of Representatives. And I think that our drug laws are a mess and they ought to be changed. And we'd be better if we went along the lines of Portugal, who don't regard it as a criminal matter.
So you think decriminalise them or make it all a health issue then for drugs?
Yeah, I mean, I was involved when I was chair of the Law Commission, I was involved in a report at the Law Commission about that was pretty well rejected out of hand.
And just moving back a step, I guess, there's this notion in New Zealand that I guess I'm trying to explore how smart do we think voters are. There's this, we sort of have a Labour government 2 terms and then it swings back and forth, and both Luxton and Jacinda, as soon as they came into leadership, the polling went right up, and the party hasn't changed the policies, they've just got a new leader. So how much, how smart are voters in regard to their base decision?
Well, it's no use saying the voters aren't smart because they're the ones who do the voting. And they determine the outcomes. But you've got to make sure they all vote. I'd favour compulsory voting. The Australians have it. And that way you get a better reflection. Although the Australian, let me just say a bit of a diversion on Australia. Australia has a constitutional arrangements that are harder to change than the United States. There have been many fewer constitutional amendments, and it's just about impossible. I remember when I was promoting the Bill of Rights, Gareth Evans was promoting it in Australia. They never got it. Haven't got it now, and we wouldn't have this terrible problem with immigration if they had one, with the 501s.
And just to wrap up, what do you view New Zealand's biggest challenge that we're facing today?
The
and
future.
Why?
How to prepare for the future, the profound changes that are going to have to take place if we're to survive on this planet, and how we're going to produce social justice with the unequal amount of wealth and incomes that people have. You can see that in New Zealand right now. But redistribution of wealth is a very difficult thing to bring about. But if you're going to have social justice, you have to.
Thank you very much for your time, Sir Geoffrey. Really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.